In the wake of Crimea's independence referendum, Hillary Clinton says Russian President Putin is a new Hitler. Zbigniew Brzezinski, former national security advisor, agrees, calling Putin not just another Hitler, but also a thug, a menace, a mafia gangster, and Mussolini. The Western mainstream media echoes this childish name-calling. Why is the whole Western foreign policy establishment so afraid of Putin? Because Putin is standing up against Western aggression, not only in Ukraine, but also in Syria and Iran. Ongoing Western attempts to destabilize these and other countries are just the most recent examples of a decades-old pattern of aggression. The long-term goal: total destruction of traditional nations and values, and the creation of a new world order global dictatorship. Since the 1953 CIA Mile 6 coup in Iran, the West has been using the same formula to overthrow legitimate but uncooperative leaders. First, sabotage a country's economy. Then bribe corrupt military officers and thugs and pay rent-a mobs to create chaos in the streets. Next, this step is optional: incite violence by paying snipers to fire into crowds, and maybe set off some bombs. Finally, send the corrupt military units and gangsters to overthrow the target nation's legitimate leader, murder or imprison his supporters, install a Western puppet in his place, and announce that order has been restored. The CIA did it to Iran's democratically elected Prime Minister Mosaddegh in 1953, to Indonesia's President Sukarno in 1965, and to Chile's Prime Minister Allende on September 11, 1973. They did the same thing to Ukraine's legitimate president, Viktor Yanukovych, a few weeks ago. The neocon regime changed after Chick Victor Nuland, the Assistant U.S. Secretary of State, got caught admitting that the U.S. had spent $5 billion to overthrow Ukraine's democratically elected government, and EU Foreign Affairs Chief Catherine Ashton was heard on tape discussing the news that the Maidan Square snipers were part of the U.S.-sponsored coup. The people of Ukraine should be worried. U.S.-sponsored coups can turn very bloody very quickly. The CIA's 1965 Indonesia coup was one of the biggest holocausts in history. According to Princeton history professor Bradley Simpson, as cited by the Jakarta Globe, the U.S. and British governments did everything in their power to ensure that the Indonesian army would carry out the mass killings of more than 1 million people following the coup against Sukarno. Most of the victims were tortured before they were murdered. The list of names of people to be tortured and murdered was provided by the CIA to their hired Indonesian thugs. While this was going on, 5-year-old Barack Obama was living in Indonesia with his stepfather Lalo Suotaro, who was working for the American mass murderers. That's right, Obama's stepfather was a Holocaust perpetrator. In 1971, following the CIA's coup in Chile, the American stooge Pinochet murdered 3,000 people and tortured 30,000. These actions were fully supported by Pinochet's American sponsors, who trained and paid the thugs and torturers. The hecatomb in Syria, too, is best understood as yet another U.S.-sponsored coup attempt. The NWO-driven Americans and their Western allies have killed tens of millions in these coups, interventions, destabilization campaigns, and undeclared wars. According to Andrei Elchik and Noam Chomsky's book on Western terrorism, the total number killed is over 50 million since World War II. If we add to this the number of people tortured, brutalized, falsely imprisoned, forced to become refugees, or who had their lives ruined by Western terrorism, the number of victims reaches the hundreds of millions. Today, the American terrorists and their NATO allies seem less interested in installing puppet governments than in reducing entire nations to chaos. The CIA NATO coup against Gaddafi has destroyed Libya as a modern nation-state. Western-backed false flag terror in Iraq is splitting of that country. Syria is being decimated by a Western-backed attempt to overthrow Assad. Venezuela, too, is being destabilized by a CIA-backed coup effort. In short, the New World Order, a shadowy group of global banking oligarchs bent on establishing the one world dictatorship, is trying to overthrow every leader on earth who resists. Russian President Putin is resisting. That is why the Western propaganda machine is calling him names. It is worth noting that Russia and Iran, the two nations most successfully resisting NW regime change, are doing so in the name of God. According to Catholic intellectual Michael Jones, the 1979 Iranian Revolution was the opening salvo of a global backlash against secularism's destruction of traditional values. Like the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan, driven by Americans' disgust with the so-called sexual revolution and the rise of Poland's Solidarity movement, which opposed communist atheism, the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran was a landmark event signaling an end to the 20th century wave of militant secularism and atheism, and a revival of traditional religion. President Putin enjoys overwhelming popularity in Russia due to his defense of traditional religious values. In his State of the Nation address last December, Putin said, "Many Euro-Atlantic countries have moved away from their roots, including Christian values. Policies are being pursued that place on the same level a multi-child family and a same-sex partnership, a faith in God and a belief in Satan." Putin's reference to Satanism was a pointed rebuke to the New World Order elites, who, though they push militant secularism on the societies they are trying to undermine, are closet Satanists. Anyone who doubts this should run the name Lieutenant Col. Michael Aquino through a search engine. Aquino, an avowed Satanist and credibly accused mass child abuser, was rewarded for his crimes against children with an appointment as Chief of Psychological Warfare for the U.S. military. For background on the satanic international banking elite, and its near-total control of Western institutions, read Nick Bryant's book The Franklin Scandal alongside the work of Canadian scholar Henry Mata. The shock troops of the NWO's war against religion and tradition and Russia and Iran are the neoconservatives. Operation Gladio terrorist Michael Ledeen explained, "Creative destruction is our middle name, both within our society and abroad. We tear down the old order every day, from business to science, literature, art, architecture, and cinema to politics and the law. Our enemies have always hated this whirlwind of energy and creativity which menaces their traditions whatever they may be and shames them for their inability to keep pace. We must destroy them to advance our historic mission." Putin is stopping New World Order creative destruction in Syria and Ukraine. He is part of a growing coalition opposing the NWO, not just religious traditionalists, but also progressive anti-globalization forces, including Hugo Chavez-inspired anti-imperialists in Latin America. We are facing an epic struggle between those who espouse sacred values such as justice and decency versus those who wish to destroy all values. God bless President Putin. When Putin kicked out Mislav and Berezovsky and arrested Khodorkovsky, he basically kicked the Rockefellers and Rothschilds out of Russia. I have good Russian sources, and am confident Putin is a nationalist who is fighting the Illuminati with all his might. When ex-NSA chief Bob Yankman spoke at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Japan on June 26, he made it very clear he expected a protracted struggle with Russia. India kicked them out in Gandhi's day and they have never been allowed back. The new development bank is multilateral development bank operated by the BRICS states Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa as an alternative to the existing U.S.-dominated World Bank and International Monetary Fund. The bank is set up to foster greater financial and development cooperation among the 5 emerging markets. Together, the 4 original BRIC countries comprise in 2014 more than 2.8 billion people, or 40% of the world's population, cover more than a quarter of the world's land area over 3 continents, and account for more than 25% of global GDP. The BRICS Bank is significant because it is a direct challenge to the global order led by the West. Many view the new BRICS Bank as a response to the failed reforms at the IMF and World Bank. The new BRICS Development Bank is unlikely to replace the IMF and World Bank, but this is defeat innately gonna slow down the US and the New World Order. Not only this, but Russia and Iran, and making a start to destroy the petrodollar. Vladimir Putin has agreed a $20 billion trade deal with Iran that will see Russia sidestep Western sanctions on its energy sector. The move is a win-win for both nations after they were hit with Western sanctions aimed at limiting their energy sectors. So maybe all this might be the motive behind the MH17 false flag.